She knocked only to survive. He opened the door just to pass another night in silence. But fate had other plans. Eliza and Jonas were strangers bound by loss, until danger forced them to become something more. Not just survivors, not just protectors. Family. The wind screamed through the valley like a wounded beast. Snow came sideways now, slashing across the dying light, devouring everything in its path. No trails, no markers. Just white and more white. Eliza Cooper pulled her shawl tighter across her shoulders, though the threadbare wool did little to fight the cold that gnawed at her bones. Beside her, 3 small figures trudged in silence, heads down, faces hidden beneath scarves and worn hats. Nathan, the oldest at 10, kept his jaw clenched tight, refusing to show weakness. Lila, barely 8, clung to his arm, her steps faltering more and more with each passing hour. And Ben, sweet, tender Ben, just 5, whimpered softly as he clung to his mother's skirt, his tiny mittens stiff with ice. Eliza's legs burned, her lips cracked every time she whispered for them to keep going. She didn't know how much farther they could make it. She wasn't sure if she would make it, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't. Not after Matthew, not after what he'd said as he rode away, leaving them stranded at Bitter Hollow with nothing but half a sack of flour and his sneer. "You'll figure it out, Eliza. You always do." She could still hear his voice in the dark, could still taste the betrayal when she realized he hadn't just left for supplies. He'd left for good. And so she walked, through the storm, through the ache, through the desperate silence, until she saw it, a light. It flickered faintly in the distance, half hidden by swaying pines and a heavy curtain of snow. A cabin. Eliza's knees buckled in relief, but she forced herself upright. "Come on," she whispered hoarsely to the children. "Just a little more." They stumbled the last 100 yards together, collapsing against the door. Eliza's knuckles were numb as she raised her hand and knocked. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time. Her voice cracked as she tried to call out, but only a raw rasp escaped her throat. Then finally the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, shadowed by firelight behind him. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, with a thick coat hanging heavy off his frame. His face was carved with sharp lines and a beard dusted with gray. But it was his eyes that struck Eliza. Cold, wary, and tired. For a long second he said nothing. Neither did she, but words weren't needed. Not when 3 frozen children clung to their mother's skirt, shivering violently. The man's jaw tensed. He stepped aside. "Get in!" Eliza didn't hesitate. She ushered the children inside, practically dragging Ben across the threshold. The door slammed shut behind them, sealing out the scream of the wind. Warmth hit them like a wave, the crackle of the hearth, the faint smell of pine and smoke. The man moved briskly, pulling chairs closer to the fire. "Sit. Get warm." Eliza obeyed, unwrapping scarves and peeling stiff coats from her children's tiny bodies. Nathan helped Lila, rubbing her arms while Ben buried himself into Eliza's lap. The man disappeared into another room, returning moments later with thick blankets and a kettle. "Drink," he said, pouring steaming water into chipped mugs. "Ain't much, but better than the cold." Eliza accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping numb fingers around it as she stole a glance at their host. He moved like a man who didn't much like company. Everything about him, from the set of his jaw to the way his boots thudded on the floorboards, spoke of solitude. Still, he hadn't turned them away. "Thank you," Eliza managed, her voice raw from wind and fear. The man grunted. He stirred the fire, sending sparks leaping up the chimney. "You come far?" he asked, finally breaking the heavy quiet. Eliza hesitated, but something about his steady presence, the way he didn't press, made her answer. 3 days, she whispered. "East of Bitter Hollow. Wagon broke. Walked the rest." The man didn't blink. "Why?" The word hit harder than she expected. Simple. Director. She swallowed, eyes darting toward her children, now huddled and half asleep near the hearth. "Left," she said finally. "Had to." That seemed enough for him. He didn't pry. Instead, he nodded slightly and leaned back against the table, arms crossed. "Name's Jonas Hale," he offered after a pause. Eliza Cooper, she replied softly. She glanced at the children. Nathan, Lila, Ben. Jonas nodded again. His face remained impassive, but his gaze softened, just a little, as he watched Ben's small hand clutching the hem of his mother's skirt, even in sleep. You're safe here, Jonas said quietly. Storm's got nowhere to go tonight, and neither do you. Relief hit Eliza so hard she almost sobbed, but she held it together. She always had. Instead, she met his eyes and whispered, Thank you. Jonas only turned back to the fire, his silhouette glowing faintly in the flicker of the flames. Outside, the storm howled against the cabin walls, but inside, for the first time in what felt like forever, Eliza and her children were safe, for now. Morning came slow. The storm had not passed, only softened. Its howl now reduced to a dull hiss like a snake coiled outside the walls, waiting for weakness. Eliza stirred first. Her back ached from sleeping upright near the hearth, but her eyes went immediately to the children. Nathan, Lila, and Ben were still bundled in borrowed quilts, their cheeks pink now with heat instead of cold. Ben's tiny hand was resting lightly on Lila's shoulder, and Nathan had shifted sometime in the night to curl protectively around both. They were safe, for now. Eliza rose carefully, her legs stiff, and glanced around the cabin. The place was plain, but not without care. Tools were lined neatly along one wall. A shelf of books, worn but organized, stood near the door. The table was scarred with use, but clean. She found Jonas outside. He stood on the porch, axe in hand, splitting kindling in clean, practiced motions. Snow still fell lightly, dusting his shoulders, but he paid it no mind. Eliza hesitated, then stepped out, pulling her shawl tight. You don't have to do all that for us, she said softly. Jonas didn't look at her as he spoke. Not doing it for you, he replied flatly. Doing it for the stove. Stove don't care who's hungry, just needs wood to burn. Eliza bit back a smile. She recognized the type, men who wore their kindness behind rough words and harder hands. Still, she didn't push. Instead, she stepped off the porch and began gathering the split wood into her arms. Jonas paused, watching her. Could have stayed inside, he said. I've been sitting too long, Eliza replied simply. Feels better to move? He nodded once, a silent approval. Together they worked, neither speaking much, but neither needing to. By the time the woodpile was replenished, the sky had lightened to a dull silver. Jonas jerked his chin toward the door. Coffee's probably still warm. Inside, the children had begun to stir. Nathan yawned and stretched. Lila sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Ben clung to the quilt, peeking out cautiously. Jonas poured coffee into 2 tin cups, black, bitter, and hot. Eliza took hers gratefully, wrapping cold fingers around the warmth. You planning to move on when the storm breaks? He asked after a moment. Eliza hesitated. I don't know. I thought I would. Had family west, or thought I did. But letters stopped coming long before winter. Jonas didn't press. Instead, he simply nodded and sipped his coffee. You ain't the first to come through here thinking West held all the answers, he said quietly. Most of the time, all you find out, there's just more questions. Eliza met his eyes across the table. For a fleeting second, something passed between them. An understanding. They were both ghosts in a way, people left behind by the world. As the day wore on, the children settled. Nathan helped Jonas with the animals, hauling hay and breaking ice in the trough. Jonas showed him how to hold the axe, how to swing without wasting strength. Lila stayed inside, helping Eliza patch torn mittens and prepare a thin stew. She asked quiet questions about Jonas. Why he lived alone. Why he didn't have a family. Ben trailed Jonas everywhere. The little boy asked endless questions, his voice small but eager. What's that knife for? Do bears come here? Can I have a horse someday? Jonas, to his credit, answered every single one. No, he said at one point, gesturing to the gun hanging by the door. That's for bears, knives for wood, or stubborn knots. By evening, something had shifted in the cabin. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable, familiar. The children laughed softly as they played near the fire. Eliza smiled as she stirred the stew, glancing every now and then at Jonas, who sat whittling a small figure. a bird, delicate and precise. She noticed the way his hands worked, slow and careful, as if shaping more than just wood. "You carve well," she said quietly. Jonas glanced up. "Something to do when the wind won't stop howling." Eliza watched him a moment longer. "I think," she began carefully, "you're kinder than you let on." Jonas didn't smile. Not exactly, but his lips twitched slightly, and that alone felt like a victory. Night fell heavy and slow. After supper, the children curled up near the hearth again, already half asleep. Eliza and Jonas sat at the table, the lamp casting soft golden light between them. Outside, the storm had lessened, but the cold still pressed against the windows. Eliza's fingers curled around her cup as she stared into the flickering shadows. "Thank you," she said suddenly, voice low but sure. Jonas raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For letting us stay. For not asking too many questions." Jonas looked away, his gaze settling on the sleeping children. "Didn't seem like you needed more questions," he murmured. "Seemed like you needed rest." Eliza felt something tight loosen in her chest. "I did," she whispered. For a moment silence settled again. Not heavy, not empty. Just easy. Jonas rose, stretching his broad shoulders. "Storm's breaking," he said. "Tomorrow you can head out if you want." Eliza nodded slowly, but something about the thought made her stomach twist. Head out. Go back into a world that had left her battered and alone. Or stay. But that was a thought for another night. For now they were safe. For now the fire burned steady. And for the first time in a long time, Eliza Cooper allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, safety wasn't temporary after all. Morning broke with a pale, uncertain light. For the first time in days, the sky held no snow. It hung heavy and gray. But still, it was clear. The storm had passed. Jonas Hale stepped onto the porch, boots crunching softly against the hardened snow. He could smell change on the air. Not just spring trying to find its way through winter's grip, but something else. Inside, Eliza and the children were already stirring. Nathan was rolling up quilts, eager to help. Lila sat braiding her doll's yarn hair while humming softly. Ben followed Jonas everywhere that morning, asking about the animals, about the trees, about life beyond snow. It felt normal. Too normal. Jonas knew better than to trust normal. By noon, Eliza stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her skirt, eyes turned toward the distant ridge where the trail disappeared into the pines. "Do you think it's safe now?" she asked softly. Jonas didn't answer right away. He set down his axe, wiping sweat and frost from his brow. "Safe ain't something the land gives," he said after a beat, "but it's quiet. That counts for something." Eliza nodded, though doubt clouded her face. For a while, they worked side by side. Jonas repaired a fence rail that had cracked under heavy snow. Eliza swept out the cabin, humming gently as the children played nearby. Something about it felt settled, rooted, and that's when the sound came. Hoofbeats. Jonas heard them first. The steady, unhurried clop of horses, not running, not racing, just confident. He stepped out of the barn, eyes narrowing toward the trail. A rider emerged from the tree line, tall, lean, and dressed in a dark wool coat, too fine for this part of the country. Another followed, then a third. The first man removed his hat, revealing slicked back hair and a smug, familiar smile. Jonas knew his type instantly. Not a drifter, not an outlaw. Something worse. A man who thought law and power were his by birthright. "Afternoon," the man called, voice smooth as creek stones. Jonas didn't reply. Behind him, he heard the cabin door creak open. Eliza stepped out, wiping her hands instinctively on her apron. She saw the men and froze. Her face went pale. "Matthew," she breathed. Jonas didn't need to ask. He knew. The man dismounted slowly, confidently, boots sinking into snow and mud. He tugged his gloves off with casual cruelty. "Hello, Eliza," Matthew Crowley drawled. "Been a long road finding you." Eliza stepped closer to Jonas, instinctively placing herself between Matthew and her children. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was thin, but steady. Matthew's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Come now. No welcome for your husband." You stopped being that when you left us to die in Bitter Hollow. Matthew tisked, shaking his head like a parent scolding a stubborn child. Come now, darling. Let's not make this dramatic. I've had time to think, to reflect. It's clear you and the children need proper care, structure, a man's hand to guide things. Jonas stiffened, jaw tightening. This ain't your place, he said flatly. Matthew's gaze slid lazily toward Jonas, sizing him up. And you are? The man whose roof they're under. Matthew chuckled low and mean. Well, isn't that convenient? Widow takes up with a stranger in the woods. Real wholesome. Jonas didn't flinch. You left them to die. I didn't. Matthew's charm cracked, his lips curling. I'm here to reclaim what's mine. I've already spoken with the sheriff in Glen Rock. I'm their father, by blood and by law. Eliza's face crumbled slightly at that word. Law. Jonas could see the fear there, not for herself, but for her children. Matthew saw it too, and he pressed. I'll come back tomorrow, he said lightly, as if discussing weather. You can have tonight to say your goodbyes. But make no mistake, Eliza, they're leaving with me. Court's orders don't take kindly to women who run. He mounted his horse again, nodding once to his men. The three turned and rode out, leaving churned snow and silence behind them. That night the cabin was a tomb of quiet dread. The children had heard everything. Nathan sat stiffly by the hearth, trying not to look scared but failing. Lila clung to Eliza, asking quietly if they'd have to leave. Ben simply cried softly into his sister's lap. Eliza paced the small room, wringing her hands raw. What am I going to do? She whispered, voice breaking. He has the law. He has money. I can't fight that. Jonas sat at the table, staring hard at the flames. You don't have to fight it alone, he said simply. Eliza stopped pacing, looking at him with red-rimmed eyes. What do you mean? Jonas leaned forward, voice low and sure. I've seen men like him before. They think paper and threats make them untouchable. But this place, this town, they've seen what you are, what you've done. You kept these children alive. You built something here. He's counting on scaring you quiet. He stood slowly, shoulders square. But we won't be quiet. Not tomorrow. Not when he rides in expecting surrender. Eliza stared at him, tears clinging to her lashes. And if he forces them to take the children? Jonas didn't hesitate. Then he'll have to take them from my hands. The fire cracked loudly, sending sparks flying. For a long moment, Eliza said nothing. Then slowly, she stepped forward, closer than she'd ever dared before. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on Jonas's arm. You would do that? For us? Jonas looked down at her hand, then back at her eyes. For family, he said quietly. I'd do more. Eliza didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, she nodded once, firm and certain. Then we stand. Together. Outside, the cold wind whispered through the trees, but inside, two souls, broken and rebuilt, had just drawn a line in the snow. And by morning, Matthew Crowley would find out exactly what that meant. Morning came sharper than a blade. The sun rose pale and cold, casting long shadows over the snow-covered hills. It should have felt like a new day, a day for thaw and promise. But for Eliza Cooper and Jonas Hale, it felt more like the eye of a coming storm. Matthew Crowley would be back. He said he'd return, and men like him didn't bluff. Not when pride and control were on the line. Inside the cabin, Eliza dressed her children carefully. Nathan was quiet, his jaw tight. Lila asked if they had to leave. Ben, too small to understand fully, clung to his mother with wide, confused eyes. You're not going anywhere, Eliza whispered to them as she brushed Lila's hair, forcing calm into her voice. No matter what that man says. Jonas was outside before dawn. He worked with methodical purpose, chopping wood, checking his rifle, reinforcing the cabin's front door. He wasn't preparing for a war, not exactly, but he wasn't planning to back down either. By the time midday came, the tension in the air was thick as smoke. And then they heard it, horses. Not just Matthew this time. He'd brought company. 4 riders came into view as the children crowded near the window. Jonas stood on the porch, arms crossed, as Matthew dismounted with deliberate slowness. His smirk was sharper today, confident. Behind him rode Sheriff Tate, a man known in these parts for minding his own business as long as his pockets stayed full. Matthew swaggered forward like he already owned the land beneath his boots. "Eliza," he called, loud enough for the whole clearing to hear. "I'm here like I promised. Time to bring my children home." Eliza appeared in the doorway, her back straight, shoulders squared despite the tremor in her fingers. "They are home," she said firmly. Matthew's smile thinned. "Let's not make this ugly. Sheriff Tate has the papers. Custody signed and sealed. I'm within my rights." Sheriff Tate unfolded a yellowed piece of paper and read aloud, his voice dull and official. "Eliza Cooper, you are hereby ordered to relinquish the children into the custody of their father, Matthew Crowley. Failure to comply—" "That's enough," Jonas interrupted, his voice low but carrying steel. All eyes turned to him. Jonas stepped forward, placing himself directly between Matthew and the cabin. "I know what you are, Crowley," Jonas said evenly. "A man who left his family to die in winter. A man who sees people as property. But not here. Not anymore." Matthew's eyes narrowed. "You don't have a say in this, Hale. The law does." Jonas didn't flinch. "The law might not care who you are, but this town does." As if on cue, voices rang out from beyond the tree line. Mrs. Webb, Pastor Connor, old Doc Briggs. They came walking, bundled against the cold, faces set with quiet resolve. Behind them, others from town, folks who had seen Eliza these past months, watched her rebuild something fragile but real. "We stand with her," Mrs. Webb said simply, stepping beside Jonas. Pastor Connor nodded. "She raised those children with grace when no one else would." Matthew's confidence faltered. "This isn't your business," he snapped. "It is now," Jonas said, calm but deadly sure. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Crowley, this paper's only good if people are willing to enforce it." Matthew's face darkened. His eyes darted between the growing crowd and the stone wall that was Jonas Hale. "You think this is over?" he hissed. "You think a few farmers and widows can stop me?" "I think you're already stopped," Jonas replied. Silence fell heavy. Matthew's bravado cracked completely. With a bitter curse, he shoved the papers back into the sheriff's hands and stormed back toward his horse. "This isn't the end," he called out over his shoulder. "No," Jonas agreed quietly. "It's the beginning." Matthew rode off, defeated, but dangerous still. The sheriff hesitated, then followed, the lawman's posture sagging as he realized which way the wind now blew. The townsfolk lingered, offering Eliza soft words and warm smiles before drifting back to their homes. They didn't celebrate. There was no need. They'd come when it mattered. That was enough. Inside the cabin, the tension broke like ice underfoot. Eliza stood by the window, watching the last riders disappear over the ridge. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. Jonas came up beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his chest. "He'll be back," she said softly. "Maybe," Jonas admitted, "but so will we, every day, as long as it takes." She looked at him then, really looked, and something inside her cracked open, not in fear, in relief. She stepped closer, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. "You didn't have to stand up for us," she whispered. Jonas turned slightly, his hand coming up to rest gently on her back. "I did," he said simply, "because you're not alone anymore." For a moment they stood together in the fading afternoon light, not as savior and saved, not as strangers forced together by circumstance, but as something far more fragile and far more powerful. Family. Outside, winter clung stubbornly to the edges of the land. But inside, beside the fire, and amid the soft breathing of sleeping children, Eliza and Jonas stood steady against the storm. And for the first time in a long, long time. Neither of them felt cold. The days that followed felt lighter. Not because the threat had vanished, Matthew Crowley's shadow still lingered somewhere beyond the ridge, but because the worst had not come. The children were still here. Eliza was still here. And Jonas Hale, who had spent more winters than he could count alone in his cabin with nothing but wood shavings and silence for company, was no longer alone. Spring came slow, but steady. The snow melted first along the edges of the cabin, forming thin rivulets that whispered past the porch. Buds broke through frozen soil, tiny splashes of green that Eliza paused to admire each morning. Inside, laughter returned like a song forgotten and found again. Nathan helped Jonas with repairs now. The boy's hands, once soft and clumsy, grew sure as he drove nails and carried wood without needing to be asked. Jonas taught him how to tie knots and sharpen tools. Nathan soaked in every word, eager to prove himself. Lila and Ben spent hours near the creek, gathering smooth stones and weaving daisy chains. They followed Jonas into the woods one afternoon, and when they returned, Lila held up a small carving he'd made for her. A fox, delicate and curious. For Ben, Jonas carved a simple whistle. The boy ran through the yard, blowing sharp, happy notes until Eliza laughed so hard she had to sit down. That sound, her laugh, startled Jonas the first time he heard it. It had been so long since this cabin had echoed with something other than wind and creaking wood. One evening, Eliza stood by the hearth, wiping flour from her hands after baking bread. Jonas sat nearby, sharpening his knife, though his eyes kept drifting toward her. The children were tucked in early, exhausted after chasing fireflies. A quiet hung between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was expectant. Eliza finally broke it. "They're happy here," she said softly. Jonas nodded. "They should be." Eliza hesitated, then crossed the room, sitting down across from him. She leaned forward slightly, voice quieter now. "But are you?" Jonas stopped working the blade. He set it down carefully, then met her gaze. "For a long time," he began, voice rough with something tender. "This place was quiet because I wanted it that way. I thought, better to be alone than carry what I lost." Eliza's eyes softened, and she didn't interrupt. "But then you came. You and them." He nodded toward the back room, where faint whispers and giggles still slipped through the cracks. "And I realized quiet isn't always peace. Sometimes it's just empty." Eliza's throat tightened. "I never meant to stay this long," she admitted. Jonas smiled faintly. "I never meant to want you to." For a moment, the words just hung there, raw and real. Eliza reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his. "We don't have much," she whispered. Jonas turned his hand over, lacing their fingers slowly. "Got enough." Eliza's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Do you really want us here, Jonas? Not just until spring, not until the threat passes, but for good?" Jonas squeezed her hand gently. "I already see this place different because of you. I hear it different. Feels like a home again." Her breath caught. "Then say it," she whispered. "Please." He looked her dead in the eyes, his voice barely louder than the crackling fire. "Stay, Eliza. Stay and make this your home. Make us your home." That was all she needed. Her face broke, tears falling silently as she stood and crossed the space between them. Jonas rose too, and before either could say more, Eliza pressed her forehead to his chest, her arms sliding around him tightly. Jonas held her, steady and warm. Not with hunger, not with desperation, but with promise. The promise of mornings filled with bread baking and children's laughter, of nights spent beside the fire, carving stories into wood and sharing dreams never dared aloud, of family chosen, built, and fought for. Later that night, after the fire had burned low and the children slept soundly, Nathan stirred. He patted out quietly, finding Jonas standing by the window, looking out over the moonlit valley. "Jonas?" the boy asked softly. Jonas turned surprised. Nathan hesitated, scuffing his foot against the floor. "Is it okay if we call this home now?" Jonas swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Yeah, Nathan," he said quietly. "It's home now." Nathan nodded, relief softening his young face. But before he turned away, he asked one more question, one that hit deeper than Jonas expected. "Is it okay if I call you something else too?" Jonas's chest tightened. "What's that?" Nathan shuffled closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Pa." Jonas's breath caught. He didn't speak. He just reached out and pulled the boy into a tight hug, holding him close as the boy's arms wrapped fiercely around his middle. Eliza watched from the doorway, unseen but smiling, her hand resting softly on her heart. Outside, the last chill of winter faded quietly into the night, and inside the word home settled, real and rooted in the walls, the fire, and the beating hearts of those who now shared it. Spring had arrived in full now. The creek behind the cabin sang louder each day, its icy chains long gone. Buds burst boldly from trees that once stood bare, and the meadow grass reached greedily toward the widening sun. But still, winter's shadow had one more part to play. It came not in blizzards or bitter winds, but in the form of hoofbeats, measured and familiar. Jonas Hale knew the sound even before he saw the rider crest the ridge. Matthew Crowley. This time he rode alone. No hired guns, no crooked sheriffs. Just a man worn thin, his fine coat dusty, his bravado dulled by distance and failure. Jonas stood on the porch when he arrived, hands calm at his sides. Behind him, the cabin door stood open, Eliza visible within. Steady, composed. She didn't cower this time. Nathan, Lila, and Ben didn't hide either. They stood beside their mother, heads high, watching. This was their home now, their fortress. Matthew pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted slowly. His boots dragged slightly through the soft mud, his steps lacking the arrogant snap they once carried. Jonas didn't speak. He didn't need to. Matthew broke the silence first. "I came for them," he said, voice rough and uncertain. Jonas raised an eyebrow. "Last I saw, the court made that decision for you." Matthew sneered weakly. "Courts change." "So do people," Jonas shot back, his voice cool but cutting. Matthew's eyes flickered toward Eliza. His jaw tightened, but there was no fire left. "What is this, huh?" he spat bitterly. "You play house with my wife, raise my kids like they're yours now?" Eliza stepped forward then, calm, resolute. "They were never yours, Matthew," she said, her voice slicing cleaner than any blade. "You gave them nothing but fear. You left them to die. Jonas gave them something you never could." Matthew scoffed, but it was hollow. "I was their blood." "Blood," Jonas said, his voice hardening, "doesn't keep them warm at night. Doesn't mend toys or tuck them in when they're sick. Blood didn't teach Nathan how to split wood, or Lila how to read better, or Ben how to smile again." Matthew stood silent as the words hit him harder than any fist. Behind Jonas, Nathan's voice broke the tension. "You're not our pa," the boy said boldly. Lila followed, her small voice steady. "Jonas is." Even Ben, clinging shyly to his sister's skirt, nodded solemnly. Matthew's shoulders sagged as if the words themselves carried weight too heavy to bear. He looked at Eliza one last time. Something flickered in his eyes. Regret, maybe. Or just the realization that what he lost was never coming back. Without another word, he turned and mounted his horse. This time, when he rode away, he didn't look back. And when he disappeared beyond the ridge, it felt different. Final. The last snow had melted. That evening, the cabin glowed warmer than ever. Jonas sat by the hearth, whittling quietly as the children played nearby. Eliza stood at the stove, stirring stew, her hair loose and soft around her shoulders. No more storm outside, no more storm inside. When dinner was done and the children tucked into their shared room, Jonas and Eliza found themselves alone by the fire. For a while, neither spoke. The crackling wood and distant sounds of frogs through the open window said enough. But eventually, Eliza rose from her chair and crossed the room, stopping just in front of Jonas. Her eyes, always filled with something careful, now held only certainty. "I meant what I said, you know," she whispered. Jonas tilted his head slightly. "That this is home?" Eliza nodded, her voice full of softness and promise. "Yes, and not just because of the walls or the land, because of you. You held us up when the world pushed us down. You stayed." Jonas set aside the piece of wood in his hand and stood. He reached for her hands, rough fingers curling around hers with the ease of something that had always been meant to fit. "I didn't know how much I needed you," he admitted quietly. "All of you." "You have us now," Eliza said, "if you want us." Jonas smiled then, a rare, quiet smile that reached all the way to his eyes. I want everything you bring through that door every morning, even the noise, especially the noise. Eliza leaned up, pressing her lips softly to his. No rush, no grand gesture, just belonging. When they parted, she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat beneath. I used to wonder, she murmured, if I'd ever feel safe again. Jonas held her tighter. You're safe, he promised. Always. Outside, the last remnants of winter melted quietly into the soft, breathing earth. Inside, beside the crackling hearth, a man who had once been hollow and a woman who had once been broken stood woven together, not by chance, but by choice. Love here wasn't loud or fast. It was carved slow, with patient hands, like wood, like trust. And as the night deepened and their home held steady around them, Eliza whispered something only Jonas heard. We're not surviving anymore, Jonas. We're living. And for the first time in his life, Jonas Hale believed her. Not every family is born. Some are chosen. What would you do to protect yours when the past comes knocking? Tell us in the comments. Your words matter here. And if you felt this story, hit like, share it, and subscribe for more tales of second chances and found homes.